Thank you, Pam, for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.
First off, I would like to know if you could give a small summary of why the Rohingya are being persecuted and when things got worse compared to what it was, for example, 20 or 30 years ago.
Sure. Well, it's important to acknowledge that the Rohingya have been persecuted in Myanmar for years. It peaked in 2017, but it started long before and continues to this day. And essentially, at the root of this campaign against the Rohingya is this belief by Myanmar's government, including the military, that the Rohingya don't belong in Myanmar and that they should go elsewhere. And in essence, that's what sparked, decades of discriminatory policies, which started with stripping them of their citizenship in the 80s, and took an even more sinister turn in 2012 with the outbreak of violence. And as I said, it peaked in 2017, and the result of the Myanmar military's brutal campaign against them, in essence, it resulted in more than 740,000 Rohingya being pushed out of the country into Bangladesh.
Yes, and the surprising thing to me is, can you tell me what happened in November 2019 and what the small country of Gambia did to actually bring justice?
Sure. I think to really make sense of that groundbreaking development, it helps to take a step back and to consider what the UN did in response to this crisis from 2017. In essence, there was a UN investigation, and that investigation resulted in a pretty comprehensive and itself a groundbreaking report, which found that recommended that Myanmar's military, senior officials in the military should be investigated for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide in particular for its acts towards the Rohingya Muslim group. And, this report landed with a lot of fanfare, but no one really knew what to do with it because the different accountability avenues, I think we might get to that a little bit later, but they're not obvious because Myanmar isn't a party to, let's say, the International Criminal Court's treaties. So that's not an automatic path for victims and survivors to get justice. But what had been previously overlooked, and this brings us to the part of the story where Gambia plays a pretty big role. Gambia, it's the smallest country in Africa, on the African continent, decided to bring a case before the International Court of Justice alleging that Myanmar had violated and was continuing to violate the Genocide Convention, to which Myanmar is a party.
Mm-hmm. Could you perhaps explain the difference as well between the ICJ and then the International Criminal Court?
Of course. So the International Criminal Court is the court where victims and survivors can see justice against individual perpetrators. So that's really about criminal responsibility for those perpetrators, seeing them brought to justice. The International Court of Justice litigates disputes between countries. So here, in the context of the Gambia action, Gambia has brought a case before the International Court of Justice saying that Myanmar has violated its state obligations not to commit genocide under the Genocide Convention.
And so how is Gambia trying to make this case, and what kind of evidence do they have, considering that Myanmar is not part of the Rome Statute, for example?
So it's a good question because, in a situation like Myanmar, where they've closed their doors to any kind of external scrutiny, external, probing or investigation, requires some creativity. In this case, Gambia has relied pretty heavily on the UN report that I mentioned earlier, which was both incredibly comprehensive in breadth and very detailed in its findings. So it's a very, it's a very strong report, and it's draws a lot of the information in it from interviews with victims and survivors in Bangladesh. As I mentioned, there's more than 740,000 of them. In fact, there's 1 million cumulatively. But they've also had access to other sources, for instance, satellite imagery that we as Human Rights Watch have also collected to illustrate the pattern of destruction by Myanmar in Rakhine State, where most of the Rohingya lived.
Okay, and since November 2019, how has the court moved forward? How is the case doing? Because we're hearing a lot about the pandemic these days, but not so much about what's going on with the Rohingya.
That's a great question. One thing I do want to say is, so I was in The Hague when Gambia filed, we got a heads up that they were going to file their case. We knew that it was coming. So I was in The Hague when it happened. Then I was in The Hague a month later when the court had what are called provisional measures hearings. Mm-hmm. Those who aren't familiar, basically, under the International Court of Justice's statute, they can order injunctive relief. So basically, it's an order directed to the countries involved in this dispute to basically stop what they're doing so that they don't make the underlying dispute worse. So the hearings took place in December, and it really, the hearings themselves grabbed a lot of headlines because the civilian leader Aung San Suu Kyi attended and defended Myanmar's military in court. Mm-hmm. In a moment when no one was even sure that Gambia or Myanmar would respond. Not only did they respond, they responded and showed up at the highest level. And so that hearing took place in December, and then a little over a month later, on January 23rd, the court unanimously decided, 1, that the Rohingya are a protected group, 2, that they remained at risk of genocide, mm-hmm. Myanmar not to commit genocide, to prevent genocide, and to preserve evidence relating to the dispute.
And what was Myanmar's defense?
I mean, the defense is what it always is, that they're misunderstood, that they're taking steps, that, it was very much reflective of, I think, the narrative within the country, which is the international community is putting a lot of pressure on us. They don't understand the pressure that we are under. But what was illuminating, I think, about the hearings themselves and the fact that State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi showed up, up until that moment, there was still something of a division between, or the perception of a division between the military, which had ruled Burma for decades prior, and the civilian government, that there was somehow daylight between the two, and that still hope that the civilian government would come and save the country and deliver on the democracy that it's long promised. But the fact that Aung San Suu Kyi came to court and defended the military's murderous campaign, I think, really put that fiction to rest.
Yes, she has a special Canadian citizenship that I think she's lost by now.
Yes.
And has Myanmar actually done anything to end the persecution or put some kind of end to the violence, or is the situation still as bad for the Rohingya, especially in some parts of the country? We have a lot of conflicts, and all of them still residing in refugee camps. Has anything been done by the government to improve the situation?
So our research says no. It hasn't. I think to understand what Myanmar is not doing, it helps to unpack what it actually means to prevent genocide under these circumstances. And the court made it pretty clear in their provisional measures order that up until that moment, that was the justification for them putting out the order in the first place, that Myanmar, what it had done so far, wasn't satisfactory. And if you look at the sort of risk factors of genocide in the country now, it's not just the threat of violence. That's always, especially given that there is an ongoing conflict in Rakhine State. But it's, looking at the discriminatory framework that targets Rohingya, that has made their access to education, to livelihoods, to healthcare, it's threatening their very lives and their way of life in the country. Those all could be indicators of genocide. And if you start looking at those more practical elements of the discriminatory policies, it's not hard to come up with a to-do list, a meaningful to-do list that Myanmar could put in place. It could ease restrictions on humanitarian access. It could dismantle the discriminatory framework that makes access to healthcare and education impossible. It could stop hate speech. there's a laundry list of things they could do, but aside from passing a few symbolic directives at the presidential level, in practice, nothing has changed. If anything, with the pandemic, things have gotten worse.
And it's also the point to have these policies to just drive them out, to drive the Rohingya out, basically, instead of, killing them, it's actually to push them out of the country.
Yes, I mean that has been a policy for. I mean that was even before 2017, and in fact, it sort of underpins their entire approach, because in their view, the Rohingya don't belong in Myanmar. They refer to them as Bengalis, and that they need to be pushed out. So that's been a consistent theme.
So we know that hate speech obviously played a big role in the genocide, especially hate speech on social media platforms, especially Facebook. That is the kind of sole platform of communication and information almost in Myanmar. And Facebook, in the UN fact-finding mission, that was made pretty clear how much Facebook contributed to the violence. But Facebook last week announced that they didn't really want to collaborate with the court and they didn't want to provide any kind of evidence. What do you think about this? And what can be done to push Facebook to, Facebook is so, it doesn't really respect privacy. So why in this case suddenly they're like, we don't want to provide any evidence, or we don't want to provide any information to the court?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish the kind of information that the Gambia, and also there's another criminal mechanism or quasi-criminal mechanism that was established by the UN in 2019. And basically its job is to collect and preserve evidence that could one day be used for criminal accountability, as we discussed before. The kind of information we're talking about, it's not even private messages. We're talking primarily public posts that were evidence of hate speech, evidence of incitement to violence that the Facebook has taken down. And what I thought was interesting about Facebook's response to a refusal to Gambia, it seemed to suggest that, it's not that they're not willing to cooperate, it's their hands are tied, they don't want to violate the Stored Communications Act. And, in other areas has, cited its ongoing, it's referred to its cooperation with the mechanism I mentioned. It's called the International Independent Mechanism for Myanmar. But what was interesting is that just yesterday, or was today, the head of that mechanism had says, look, we have been in conversation with Facebook for a year and they have revealed nothing. I mean, the question that you're asking, I think, is better directed to Facebook. Why aren't they sharing the information? If they say that they're committed to accountability and righting past wrongs, then why wouldn't they share this once public information with bodies that are in a position to do something with it?
Yeah, believe me, my list of questions to Mark Zuckerberg is usually getting longer by the day these days. No, but what other challenges does the court face right now in terms of both evidence, but also in terms of funding, probably?
Which court are you?
The ICJ.
Well, the ICJ case, because the court itself is a UN organ, and because it's Gambia that's brought the case and Myanmar is responding, I mean, both of those individual states have to foot their respective costs. With respect to the UN mechanism that I mentioned, the WRM, that was established back in 2018, that's funded out of the UN budget, the regular UN budget. That's not to say that its budget is a cakewalk or guaranteed, because as you can imagine, I mean, you have to just take one look at the sort of bleak geopolitical landscape at the UN to guess at which states would, or which countries would rather do away with these accountability mechanisms. So that's an ongoing battle, and it's really up to the UN member states committed to accountability to keep putting their money where their mouth is and funding these initiatives.
And I think as an organization, you continue to look at the situation now. And we're facing a global pandemic, and we have a lot of Rohingya in IDP camps and refugee camps, and where it's impossible to physically distance, where they have barely access to sanitation and healthcare. So what is the situation of them for them now in these camps?
So, we actually did some research that we put out a couple of months ago on the situation of the Rohingya that are still stuck in camps or basically open air detention in Rakhine State. Mm-hmm. And, specifically the research that we'd done revealed that, if it was bad before, the restrictions on the Rohingya, if they were bad before, they're even worse now in terms of, how they're extorted at, military and security checkpoints. They had limited access to healthcare before. It's even worse now. There's no testing capacity. And, if, someone does test positive or if there is an outbreak, the ability of the healthcare system within Rakhine State, which is one of the most, it's so poorly funded anyway. But, in the face of a pandemic, you can only really imagine the worst.
And are neighboring countries doing anything to put more pressure on the government to act? I don't think the US is really doing anything because it's not really a leader on the world stage right now. I know Canada has done a little bit, but are neighboring countries doing anything to improve the situation now?
Well, Canada is definitely on our list to do more. But I think that there are a couple of different platforms. So first, let's start with what states could be saying to Myanmar directly in their bilateral relations. We have a unanimous provisional measures order from a UN court. They need to be asking the question, what are you doing to implement it beyond these superficial directives? Like, show me statistics about humanitarian access. Show me show me the, information or data about how hospitals are being utilized. They need to be asking the right, not just questions, but the right questions to really push Myanmar on its implementation. But, there are also various UN fora. There's the UN General Assembly, there's a UN Human Rights Council, there's the UN Security Council. Now, I will say that at both the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, there's a good resolution. So basically, it's ostensibly a piece of paper, but it's really a piece of paper agreed upon by most states expressing concern about the situation in Myanmar. Mm-hmm. It had really good resolutions out of both of those bodies, and here's why they're important. Yes, they're a piece of paper, they're important political statements, but they're also read by the ICJ's judges. That was the basis that the judges used, or part of the basis, when they decided that Myanmar wasn't doing enough. So those pieces of paper really matter, they mean something. The open question is the Security Council. The Security Council has been, it's the membership, it's 15 members, really it's 5 permanent members, remain bitterly divided, which, has yielded a number of casualties, of which Myanmar is but one. But nonetheless, I think that there is still more scope for those united on the council, and I think we have the numbers, but those united on the council to express their concern in a formal way, that is through a formal session of the Security Council, to put more pressure on Myanmar to do more, especially with the upcoming elections.
But that is obviously very unlikely to include China, considering China is persecuting the Uyghurs in their own country. So it's not, I just think that anything might be blocked by China, Russia, for example.
And for the most part, it's not just formal blocking, but it's self-censorship that I think a lot of countries absorb because they don't want to annoy China. But the reality is that if you want to have a formal session on a particular area or country of concern, you only need 9 votes. And China, there's no veto. China can't block it. So while China can't quash any outcome, or you need China's buy-in for any kind of outcome, you don't need their buy-in. Mm-hmm. As I said, like a formal discussion and formal engagement by the council to express concern.
Okay. And what is Human Rights Watch doing for the Rohingya? What's your plan for the next few months, for example, in terms of perhaps providing more evidence or doing more reports?
So the work that we do on Myanmar is pretty extensive, and it's not only in relation to the conditions the Rohingya are facing, although that's the work that we do. So I would say, moving forward beyond, the terrible human rights and humanitarian situation in the country, we're also looking at the closing space for freedom of expression. I have a colleague who's done a really excellent work to explain why, Myanmar, or how Myanmar is using these really problematic laws to quell any kind of constructive engagement by civil society, by journalists, and a space for them to work, frankly. Myanmar is still facing an internet blackout. That's a problem, because if people don't have access to information, they can't, how are they going to get whatever little humanitarian aid is available? They're cut off from the information about it. They're cut off from information, in relation to the ongoing conflict. There is a conflict that is continuing in the Rakhine army and Myanmar's military in Rakhine State, which has made the situation for civilians even more perilous. The internet blackout makes it worse. So, just to give you a taste of the kinds of issues that we look at, we're really trying to figure out ways, make recommendations aimed at realizing the promise of a democratic transition on a very bleak landscape where it seems increasingly impossible.
And do you think we placed too much hope in Aung San Suu Kyi and Myanmar when the transition first happened? Because a lot of us were disappointed.
I mean, look, I think it's a good lesson in, not putting all of your expectations on the shoulders of one person, and looking at, taking a clear-eyed view of the institutional weaknesses, or rather, what institutions need to be strengthened to deliver on the promise of democracy. Because it's never, even with the most well-intentioned person, it's not reasonable to expect them to deliver. And in this situation where, we've felt nothing but profound disappointment, it's all the more urgent to look to other avenues to again, realize on the promise and hope for democracy.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being part of this discussion today. We will share the work that you've done with Human Rights Watch widely, and I hope people keep an eye on the situation, because obviously now a lot of people focus on the pandemic and a little bit more in Myanmar. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.